Frank Miller made his choice the moment the Black family walked through his door. He'd made that same choice 100 times before, Alabama in 1964, and Frank ran his diner the way he saw fit. Sorry folks, we don't serve your kind, try the colored place on 5th. What Frank didn't see was the man at the counter, the one in the worn cowboy hat, slowly standing up. Frank, those people are hungry, serve them. Frank turned, irritated. Not happening, friend, my diner, my rules. The cowboy nodded. Fair enough, then I'm out. He pulled a $20 bill from his wallet and put it on the counter. Keep the change, and keep your rules. As he walked toward the door, 3 other customers stood up to follow him. Then 5 more. Then half the diner. Frank finally looked at the man's face and felt his stomach drop. John Wayne was walking out of his restaurant, and he was taking most of Frank's customers with him. It was June 1964, 3 weeks after President Johnson had signed the Civil Rights Act. The law said discrimination was illegal. But in small-town Alabama, the law was one thing and practice was another. Miller's Diner sat on Highway 80, halfway between Selma and Montgomery. It had been there for 20 years, serving travelers, locals, and anyone who wanted a hot meal and a cold drink. Frank Miller, 55 years old, had run it for the last 12 years. The diner had 15 stools at the counter, 8 booths along the windows, and a sign on the door that read, "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." Everyone knew what that meant. John Wayne was driving from Louisiana to Georgia, taking back roads to avoid attention. At 57, he was one of the biggest movie stars in the world, but he'd learned that traveling in plain clothes, in an unmarked car, let him move through the country without the circus that came with fame. He'd been driving for 4 hours and needed lunch. When he saw Miller's Diner, he pulled in. John walked in wearing faded jeans, a work shirt, and a Stetson that had seen better days. He looked like any other traveler, a cowboy, a rancher, someone passing through. He took a seat at the counter. A waitress, a woman in her 40s named Betty, brought him a menu and coffee without really looking at him. "What's good?" John asked. "Meatloaf's fresh. Chicken fried steak if you want something heavier." "Meatloaf sounds fine." Betty wrote it down and walked back to the kitchen. Frank was behind the counter, working the register, keeping an eye on the lunch crowd. About a dozen people in the diner, all white, all local except for a few travelers like John. John was halfway through his meal when the door opened. A Black family walked in, a man, a woman, and a young girl, maybe 8 years old. The father, James Williams, held the door for his wife Sarah and daughter Grace. They stood near the entrance for a moment, uncertain. John watched Frank's face change. Watched the calculation, the decision being made before anyone said a word. Frank walked over to the family. His voice was loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "Sorry folks, we don't serve your kind here. Try the colored place on 5th Street. James Williams nodded quietly. "Yes sir, thank you." He put his hand on his daughter's shoulder and turned to leave. John set down his fork. "Frank," he said, his voice calm but clear. "Those people are hungry, serve them." The diner went quiet. Everyone turned to look at the man at the counter. Frank walked back behind the register, irritated. "Not happening, friend. My diner, my rules. You want to eat, eat, but don't tell me how to run my business." John turned on his stool to face Frank. "It's not about your business, it's about doing what's right. That man, his wife, their daughter, they're hungry. You have food, serve them." Frank's face hardened. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but this is Alabama. We have rules. I serve who I want to serve, and I'm not serving them. You got a problem with that, there's the door." John looked at Frank for a long moment. Then he pulled out his wallet, took out a $20 bill, and put it on the counter next to his half-eaten plate of meatloaf. "Fair enough," John said quietly. "Then I'm out, keep the change, and keep your rules." He stood up, picked up his Stetson, and started walking toward the door. The Williams family was still standing near the entrance, preparing to leave. John tipped his hat to them as he passed. "I'm sorry about this." James Williams nodded. "It's all right, sir, we're used to it." John stopped at the door and turned back to the diner. "Anyone else sick of these rules?" For a moment, nobody moved. Then a man at one of the booths, a farmer in his 60s, stood up. He threw $2 on his table and walked toward the door. "I am," he said. Then a woman at the counter stood up. Then another man from a booth. Within 30 seconds, 3 people had stood up. Then 5, then 8. Frank watched, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion to anger. "What the hell is this?" Betty, the waitress, was staring at the man who'd started this. Something about his face, the way he carried himself. Then it clicked. "Frank," she said quietly. "That's John Wayne." Frank's face went white. He looked at the man standing by the door, really looked at him for the first time. John Wayne. The John Wayne. The man whose movies played at the theater down the street every month. The man whose face was on posters all over town. By now, half the diner had stood up and was walking toward the exit. Some left money on their tables. Some didn't. They just walked out, following John Wayne out the door. John held the door open as people filed out. When James Williams and his family tried to leave, John stopped them gently. "Hold on," he said. He turned back to Frank, who was still standing behind the counter, looking shell-shocked. "Frank, I'll make you a deal. Serve this family. Give them whatever they want, my treat. I'll pay for it, I'll leave, and you can go back to running your diner however you want." Frank's jaw worked. His diner was half empty now. The people who'd walked out were standing in the parking lot, watching through the windows. Betty stepped forward. "Frank, just do it, it's John Wayne. And half our customers just left." Frank looked at the family, then at John, then at Betty. Then he looked around his half-empty diner. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "One meal, then they leave." John nodded. "Fair enough." He looked at James Williams. "Sir, please sit down, order whatever you and your family want." James hesitated. "Mr. Wayne, you don't have to do this." "I know I don't, but I'm going to." John turned to Frank. "And Frank, you're going to serve them like you'd serve anybody else. With respect." The Williams family sat down in a booth. Grace, the 8-year-old, looked scared and confused. Sarah held her daughter's hand. Betty brought them menus. Her hands were shaking slightly. John stayed by the door, watching. The people who'd walked out stayed in the parking lot, also watching. James ordered 3 meals, carefully, quietly, choosing the cheapest items on the menu. John called out from the door. "Sir, order whatever you want. Don't look at the prices. Get what you actually want to eat." James looked at his daughter, then at the menu. "Grace, what do you want?" Grace whispered something to her father. James smiled slightly. "She wants the hamburger and a milkshake." "Then that's what she should have brought," John said. Frank stood behind the counter, his face red, his hands clenched. Betty took the order and brought it to the kitchen. For the next 20 minutes, John Wayne stood by the door of Miller's Diner while the Williams family ate their meal. He didn't sit down. Didn't leave. Just stood there, making sure nothing else happened. The customers who'd walked out stayed in the parking lot. A few of them started talking to each other, realizing they'd all made the same choice at the same time. When the Williams family finished eating, James tried to pay. John waved him off. "It's covered." James stood up, extending his hand to John. "Mr. Wayne, I don't know how to thank you." John shook his hand. "You don't need to thank me. You and your family have as much right to eat here as anybody. I'm just sorry it took all this to make it happen." Sarah Williams had tears in her eyes. "God bless you, sir." John walked them to their car, then came back inside. He went to the counter where Frank was standing, still looking shaken. "Frank, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen. That family you just served? They're good people. They're hungry, they're traveling, they needed a meal. Just like everybody else who walks through that door. The color of their skin doesn't change that." Frank said nothing. "I know this is Alabama. I know things are the way they are. But they're changing. The law changed 3 weeks ago. You can fight it or you can accept it. But if you fight it, you're going to lose customers. You're going to lose business. And you're going to lose your self-respect." John put another $20 on the counter. "That's for the family's meal and for your trouble. You keep that diner however you want, but remember what happened here today." He walked out. In the parking lot, Several of the customers who'd walked out were waiting. One of them, the older farmer, approached John. "Mr. Wayne, that was a good thing you did." John shook his head. "I just stood up. You all walked out with me. That's what made the difference." They stood there for a moment, a group of strangers who'd made a collective choice. Then, one by one, they shook John's hand and went back to their cars. John drove away from Miller's Diner, back onto Highway 80, continuing east toward Georgia. He didn't talk about what happened. Didn't tell the press. Didn't mention it in interviews. As far as John was concerned, it was just something that needed doing, so he did it. But in that small town between Selma and Montgomery, the story spread. The people who'd walked out told other people. Betty, the waitress, told her friends. Even Frank, in his own bitter way, told the story at the bar that night. Within a week, everyone in town knew John Wayne had walked out of Miller's Diner, and half the lunch crowd had followed him, all because Frank Miller refused to serve a black family. Some people in town thought John was a troublemaker. Said he should have minded his own business. Said he didn't understand how things worked in Alabama. But other people, more people than anyone expected, said he'd done the right thing. Said they'd been thinking the same thing for years but never had the courage to say it. Said maybe it was time things changed. Frank Miller kept his diner open. But things were different after that day. Word had gotten out. Some customers stopped coming. Others, white and black both, started coming specifically because of what happened, wanting to see if Frank had changed. Frank never said John Wayne was right. But 2 weeks after the incident, a black family came in for dinner. Frank served them. Without comment, without drama. He just served them. Betty later said she saw something change in Frank that day when half his diner walked out. He realized his rules cost him something. Cost him customers, cost him respect. I don't think he ever liked it. But he learned he couldn't keep running his business the way he had been. The customers who'd walked out that day remembered it differently than they expected. They'd thought they were following John Wayne. But later, talking about it, they realized they'd been making their own choice. John had just given them permission to act on something they'd been feeling for a long time. One of them, a man named Robert Hayes, later said, "I'd seen Frank refuse service to black folks a dozen times. Always felt wrong. But I never said anything, never did anything. Then John Wayne stood up, and I realized I'd been waiting for someone else to go first. That was my shame. John didn't do it for me. He did it in front of me. And that made me have to choose." Years later, in 1979, after John Wayne died, the Williams family was contacted by a reporter writing about John's life. They told the story of that day in Miller's Diner. "We were just trying to feed our daughter," James Williams said. "We'd been turned away from 3 other places that day. We almost didn't even try Miller's Diner. But Grace was crying from hunger, so we did. When Mr. Wayne stood up for us, it wasn't just about the meal. It was about dignity. He treated us like we mattered." In 1964 Alabama, that meant everything. Grace Williams, by then a grown woman with children of her own, added, "I didn't understand what was happening that day. I just knew I was hungry, and there was a man in a cowboy hat who made sure I got to eat. When I got older and realized that man was John Wayne, one of the most famous people in the world, I understood something important. He didn't do it for publicity or recognition. He did it because it was right. That's what heroes actually do." Frank Miller died in 1985. His diner closed a few years later. But people in that town still tell the story of the day John Wayne walked in, stood up for a black family, and led half the lunch crowd out the door. They tell it as a lesson about courage. About how one person standing up can give others permission to do the same. About how sometimes doing the right thing costs you something, and you do it anyway. Frank made his choice that day. So did John Wayne. So did the dozen people who walked out. And in a small way, that day in June 1964 at Miller's Diner, a little piece of Alabama changed. Not because the law said it had to. Because people decided it should. John Wayne drove himself to Georgia, ate at roadside diners, stayed in small motels, and never mentioned what happened to the press. As far as he was concerned, he'd just stood up for what was right. And he'd given a hungry little girl a hamburger and a milkshake. Sometimes, that's all it takes to change the world.